Okay. Welcome to week 5. We have done sort of a speed warp zoom through a lot of history and asking a lot of questions and looking at our own church, doing sort of a racial autobiography. Today, we're only going to stay on one question only. It's chapter 10 of Jemar Tisby's book, Color of Compromise, Considering Racial Reconciliation in the Age of Black Lives Matter. So today we're slowing down the pace, looking at one thing and one thing only. Before we begin today, I want to remind you that February is Black History Month. You might want to consider how you engage in that in some way. And then maybe how we might think about not having a Black History Month if this issue ever is not just dealt with as a sideline issue, how it becomes part of our whole. So think about both of those things as you walk through February this month. All right, as I said, we're moving into one issue and one issue only today, and it's Black Lives Matter. For First Presbyterian Church of Deerfield, at least, this is a painful subject with passions running pretty high on both sides. I'm sure that's true for some of your churches as well. So I want to simply start by taking a deep breath. Looking at some context, just looking at some pictures so that you know that it's not just First Presbyterian Deerfield or Libertyville or Arlington Heights. It's also an issue for members of our church who have put signs in their own front yard and have had them defaced or removed. You'll recognize this. This is First Presbyterian of Libertyville and Fourth Presbyterian Chicago. These are the Black Lives Matters rallies that happened in downtown Deerfield and in downtown Highland Park. Here is a gathering of Lake County churches in Waukegan, a worship service held in order to support Black Lives Matter. For First Presbyterian of Deerfield, in a compromise, we chose to alter the wording to Black Lives Are Important because we couldn't quite get behind the Black Lives Matter, but wanted to do something. At the same time that was happening, the children of our church were asked to make signs simply to let people driving along Waukegan know that our closed church was not closed, that the people in it were still active. Look at some of the signs that our children made. And then these signs were only on display for about a day. Here's Lutheran Church of the Cross in Arlington Heights, who put a sign up and promptly had Black Lives cut out of the sign. This is Hope Presbyterian in Wheaton, who not only had their main front sign lit on fire, they had the rest of the signs they put up around their church destroyed. And this is Northminster Presbyterian of Evanston, who had this sign out, had the black immediately cut out of it. And not the church, but the community rallied around them to replace the word, to put other signs up. The fourth sign that they have put up, since the others were destroyed, is now hanging on the side of their church 10 feet up so that it cannot be damaged again. Here are other just random signs from near us. These signs show us the depth of the passion for, the anger against the church's involvement in support for Black Lives Matter. I want to remind you the really encouraging thing about looking at these photos is that there is passion on all sides, that somehow the issue has touched our hearts, that we know that some way it's important, that we're actively engaging in the debate, putting up signs, destroying signs, not doing anything, complaining about the signs. Well, somehow or another, we are involved. The conversations around Black Lives Matter signs go something like this. These are a few of the things that I've heard from our own church, and I'm trying to capture the essence of the conversations accurately. The sign's wording directly names the issue and we are facing in society and speaks to what we are called to do. This is about people, not politics. It's the church's role to speak to justice, Our church should not be out of step with statements from our Presbytery and other PCA churches. We may lose members because of the sign, and we may have a hard time recruiting new members if our position on the uprising of our time is not clearly on the side of justice and mercy. If we're silent on this matter, well, that's a statement unto itself. Black Lives Matter is important to affirm because our time has made that a question. The sign's wording directly names the issue we are facing as a society and speaks to what we are called to do. On the opposite side, we find equally passionate responses. Black Lives Matter refers to a political organization, and we don't want to suggest affiliation with this organization. Keep our church out of politics. Black Lives Matter denotes negative actions, and we should find words that unite people. We may lose members and find it difficult to recruit new members. Why can't we just say that all lives matter? Saying Black Lives Matter is just virtue signaling. We have concerns about the explicit language of the sign. We should be inclusive of all, and Black Lives Matter doesn't do that. I may not have captured all of the arguments, but this is the essence of what I at least have been hearing. So much passion, so many voices, so much engagement on the issue. So in the last number of weeks, I have been asking you about how your interpretation of theology informs your lived expression of being a follower of Christ. I have been asking you if the church has a voice in society. I have been asking you if you're able to understand how and why Blacks and whites see racial justice differently. I've walked you through a racial autobiography of our own church, our painful history with segregation, and have suggested to you that it's something you should do for yourself and your own church as well. And I'd like you to consider how all of the questions that we have been exploring come into play today with the issue of Black Lives Matter. I want to remind you that the sign is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much underneath. You have taken the time to come to this class in order to take the next step, since putting up a sign should not be the only thing our churches are doing. Reverend Michael Kirby of Northminster Presbyterian, where you saw that sign, that last sign, says, but if your only action is to put up a sign, don't do it. He is reminding us of this iceberg metaphor, that we need to consider what is beneath what we see on the surface. We need to tell and understand our stories. We need to remember where we came from in order to be able to move forward. We need to hear the stories of our history. We need to hear the stories of people of color. And he is suggesting that if we don't have the stamina and the wherewithal to deal with all that's underneath, then don't bother at all. If a sign is your only action, don't do it. How do we begin to address these issues? Now, I promise you in a minute, I'm going to let Jemar Tisby speak, but I want to again remind you of what we were covering last week. How can the white church learn to see the issues of racial justice from a Black perspective? How can our beliefs about faith and justice be expanded by listening to our Black brothers and sisters? I'm going to go full on English teacher for you here just a minute. We're going to be talking about cultural toolkits. And when we taught Tim O'Brien's Vietnam War story, the things they carried to high schoolers, we asked them first, well, what was it that soldiers carried with them as they went into Vietnam? And the students very, very easily could see, well, they carried their supplies. They carried their food. They listed all the tangible things that they carried. And as we pushed them further, they could finally get to the intangible, the heartache, the joy, the attitudes that they went into the war with, the allegiances, the grudges, their religion, their family, their mental habits, their practices, their skills, so many things they carried with them. This things they carried concept is what is known as a cultural toolkit. What are the things we carry with us? People do not just live in a culture, but they carry the elements of that same culture. Culture creates ways for individuals and groups to organize experiences and evaluate reality. It does so by providing a repertoire of toolkit ideas, habits, skills, and styles. So what is it that you carry with you? Tisby is arguing that it's partly due to our differing cultural toolkits that we have a difficult time understanding how racial justice looks from both sides. This is part of what we were looking at last week. But he further argues that the toolkit elements perpetuate racism. And he looks at three specifically. The first element is labeled accountable individualism, and we have talked about this before. It's the idea that, of course, individuals are accountable for their actions, but then we separate that idea from institutions and structures. We talk about the need to take responsibility, but we don't see what is underneath that. The example here is Jared Kushner. He is questioning if Blacks even want to be successful since they haven't pulled themselves up by the same bootstraps that he has. His complaint is that Black Lives Matter, if support of that is just virtue signaling. In other words, it's being politically correct. In other words, the only reason we would do it is to enhance our own image. A Black CBS commentator responded to Kushner. He said, Jared Kushner speaks as if Black people are lazy complainers who don't want to be successful. This blatant disrespect shows that he has no understanding of the Black community and its challenges that have spanned centuries. Now, you saw this cartoon a number of weeks. It's the simplistic explanation of systemic racism. The Black commentator I talked about goes on to say, when African Americans find fault in policies that have led to historic unemployment for Blacks, an explosion of racial inequalities and wealth gaps, and an uncontained global pandemic that has had a disproportionate impact on Black lives, to some, that's taken to mean that we just don't want to be successful badly enough. And to Blacks, this looks like systemic racism. A second element in the cultural toolkit that many white evangelical Christians may carry is relationalism. And again, we've talked about this before. It's the emphasis on the interpersonal relationships without seeing the systemic issues behind it. It's this cartoon. I have 6 Black friends, so I'm definitely not racist, right? And then the attitude that goes from that, can't we just get along then, is seen as a way to solve the problems of his systemic racism. We talked about this week 1 when we talked about the definition of racism and the definition of systemic racism. The difference between looking at bigotry in individual relationships versus considering the power components that go into that as well. Prejudice plus power, which involves the power of systems, institutions, policies that have and that are enacting prejudice. So an emphasis on one-on-one relationships allows one to see race as an individual problem, not as a systemic problem. The third element that Tisby talks about that may perpetuate racism from a white Christian perspective is anti-structuralism. And the best way to explain this is simply the cartoon here. It's an inability to see what's going on because you're focusing on the wrong thing. Are you steering? And the boat is sinking. Not seeing the systems, the structures that might be at the root of the problem. Tisby again challenges us further with this. Absent from this, their account of white supremacy, of this concept, is the idea that poor relationships might be shaped by social structures, such as laws and the way institutions operate or form or other forms of segregation. So again, shifting an emphasis away. So those 3 things. Tisby is asking that Might we be contributing to the problem by focusing on individual accountability, thinking that race problems are mainly about interpersonal relationships, and focusing on the wrong things without seeing the structural elements, the systems that might be contributing to the problem? The systems like the restrictive covenants we talked about, or issues that we know, the crime of being pulled over for driving while Black. So Tisby's argument is that because we see things so differently, because we come to the situation from differing cultural toolkits, it's difficult for white and Black Christians to see things the same way. He reminds us that racism never goes away, it just adapts. So what does racism look like in the 21st century? It looks like responding to the phrase Black Lives Matter with the phrase all lives matter. Might we be able to understand this as a racist statement if we listen to the voices of our Black brothers and sisters? One more thing before we hear Tisby. Another contributing factor to the tension over the appropriateness of this phrase is the confusion over exactly what it is. Is this a slogan? Is it an organization? Is it political? Does it advocate violence? Is it a global movement? How do all of these things intertwine? Are we supporting a concept, a people, or a violent activist organization? So to hear some of the answers to that, I simply want you to listen to Jemar Tisby.
Let's talk about Black Lives Matter. On July 13th, 2013, Alicia Garza, a Black activist and writer in Oakland, California, sat down at a computer and penned what she called a love note to Black people. In this love note, she said, "Black people, I love you. I love us. Our lives matter." A friend and fellow activist named Patrice Cullors responded with a post of her own that ended in the phrase, "Black Lives Matter." Together with Opal Tometi, these two women started what became the Black Lives Matter movement. What most people don't realize is that what prompted Black Lives Matter, or BLM for short, originally was news that George Zimmerman, the man who killed Trayvon Martin in Florida in 2012, had been acquitted of all charges. Remember the Trayvon Martin case? He was a Black 17-year-old. He'd been walking back to his father's fiance's townhouse in Sanford, Florida. Reports say he had a bag of Skittles and an iced tea in his hand, and he wore a sweatshirt with a hood, otherwise known as a hoodie. Zimmerman was suspicious of Martin, pursued him against the orders of the police whom he had called, and an altercation occurred. Although the details are not precisely known, when paramedics arrived at 7:30 p.m., Trayvon Martin lay dead from a single close-range bullet to the chest. Zimmerman a year later was acquitted under Florida's Stand Your Ground law, which permits the use of lethal force if a person merely feels threatened. Black and white people viewed this incident from drastically different perspectives, partly because of that cultural toolkit we were talking about earlier. As further evidence of the divide, a Pew Research poll indicated that 49% of whites were satisfied with the acquittal verdict, but only 5% of Black people thought the same. 28% of whites agreed that Martin's death should spark more discussions on race, but 78% of Black people said it should. Now, the same divide was apparent later on with Mike Brown and his death at the hands of white police officer Darren Wilson. This happened in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. Again, the details are murky. Only one side lived to tell the tale. There was an altercation on the streets of this small town near St. Louis, and Mike Brown ended up dead. Initial reports indicated that he had his hands up in a gesture of surrender, and it spawned the chant, "Hands up, don't shoot." Now, later on, a Department of Justice report indicated that Mike Brown probably didn't have his hands up. But that's not the only report that came out. There were two reports, and the other one was focused on the Ferguson Police Department. It indicated a pattern of police abuse and misconduct. And it was in response to Mike Brown's killing that protesters took to the streets and started chanting Black Lives Matter. They took to the streets in more than 150 cities, protesting not just this incident with Mike Brown, but a pattern and a history of police brutality enacted in Black communities. And there were so many other tragic stories. You remember this period from about 2014 to 2017, and really it's ongoing of all of these human beings who became hashtags. Stephon Clark, Philando Castile, Freddie Gray, Rekia Boyd, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland. The list goes on and on and on. Black Lives Matter conveys a depth of meaning. I want to talk about two of them. Number one, Black Lives Matter serves as an assertion of the image of God in Black people. When people say Black Lives Matter, it doesn't mean that only Black Lives Matter. It means that Black Lives Matter too. Why? If you go all the way back to the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, God said, "Let us make humankind in our image and in our likeness." And those passages of scripture say that every human being, no matter their race, nationality, language, gender, or any other distinction, every person has the fingerprint of God upon them. And because of that, they are worthy of dignity. And so when people say Black Lives Matter, they're saying Black people are made in the image of God too, and should be treated that way. A second meaning of Black Lives Matter is that it functions as a cry of lament. Theologian and professor Sung-Chan Rah wrote a book called Prophetic Lament. And in it, he said, lament is a liturgical response to the reality of suffering that engages God in the context of pain and suffering. He goes on to explain that lament expresses indignation, even outrage about the experience of suffering. Black Lives Matter then presents Christians with an opportunity to weep with those who weep. In other words, to lament the fact that the lives of Black people have been systematically extinguished in so many ways throughout American history. Now, in spite of the depth of meaning of that phrase, Black Lives Matter, there have been various Christian responses to the movement. I think it's helpful, though, to make a comparison. Just as the Black Power movement was more than the Black Panther Party, which was just one organization in the midst of the broader movement, the Black Lives Matter movement is more than the Black Lives Matter organization. And we can differentiate between Black Lives Matter, the principle, the idea, the concept, and Black Lives Matter, the organization. Because many Christians object to the organization because it doesn't explicitly identify as Christian, and the status and platform they would disagree with. And so because some Christians reject Black Lives Matter, the organization, they've actually distanced themselves and opposed the movement and rejected the entire concept of Black Lives Matter itself. But I think Black Lives Matter should prompt critical engagement from Christians rather than this reflexive rejection. So let's talk about how differing views among Christians and Black Lives Matter actually affected real people, because I think hearing the impact of this division makes it less heady, and we can understand how this is actually causing real pain among many Christians in the church. So my friend Lecrae is a Grammy award-winning hip-hop artist, and he got his start among white evangelicals. In fact, they made up the majority of his audience from his beginnings as a rapper in the mid-2000s. But later on, when he started speaking up about Ferguson and Black Lives Matter, the backlash came swift and fierce. On social media sites, white evangelicals accused him of playing the race card and creating division because he was talking about racism. Lecrae wrote in an article in the Huffington Post, and he said, "I hit a serious low on tour at one point. I was done with the American Christian culture. No voice of my own, no authenticity. I was a puppet." You see, Lecrae realized that his acceptance among many of his white fans was based on the condition of complicity in silence toward racism. He couldn't do it anymore. And for a time, it even affected his relationship with God and Christianity in general. Now, there are countless examples, but let's look at just one more. Michelle Higgins is another friend of mine, a Black woman who leads musical worship at her Presbyterian church in St. Louis. When Ferguson happened, she was among the many people of faith who took to the streets and to the halls of government to protest in various ways. At a large evangelical student conference called Urbana, she was invited to give a keynote presentation. And there she told the 16,000 students assembled that, quote, "Black Lives Matter is not a mission of hate. It is not a mission to bring about incredible anti-Christian values and reforms to the world." She criticized the primacy of abortion as the singular issue among many white evangelicals, especially when it came to other issues like adoption and different quality of life indicators. So you can imagine the response. In a New York Times article, the president of the sponsoring group, InterVarsity, puts on the Urbana conference. The president said, "We got blowback from just about every side. Certainly, we have donors and friends who have raised concerns and questions." To be fair, others contacted him regarding this focus on Black Lives Matter and said, "Bravo, that was brave and courageous." But the reactions to Lecrae and Michelle Higgins merely illustrate common attitudes that many white evangelicals have regarding racial justice. Another study by the Barna Research Group showed that just 13% of white evangelicals supported the message of Black Lives Matter. On the same question, only 7% of Republicans agreed. So, in the summary of that report from Barna, they said, if you're a white evangelical Republican, you are less likely to think race is a problem, but more likely to think you are a victim of reverse racism. Now, a lot of people ask me, well, should I get involved with Black Lives Matter or this current movement? And honestly, there are no easy answers about which activist groups to get involved with. I can't give you a blanket recommendation. What I can say is that for the most part, the only wrong action is inaction.
Okay, just a second. I'm going to get out of this slide.
Let's talk about Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, hold it. There we go. So I've asked you to listen to Tisby. I would also ask you to pay attention to the resources that we as Presbyterians have so readily available to us. What does our own Presbyterian church say? Do you look at the resources that are there for you? I encourage you to go to the PCUSA website for answers and resources. It's a helpful resource to answer some of the questions that you might have. They specifically have written out their responses to all of these questions for your consideration. Why are we saying that Presbyterians affirm Black Lives Matter, but don't all lives matter? Does that mean we're claiming affiliation with a Black Lives Matter organization? I'm sorry, but I just cannot agree with supporting the Black Lives Matter organization. Or I feel that the Presbyterian Church is getting too political and hopping on to the latest bandwagon. The website answers each of these questions in depth. So you've heard Tisby, you've heard our own Presbyterian Church. I would ask you also to consider what our own Book of Order has to say about this. If you go to the website, you'll see this answer, but the statement from the Book of Order is also challenging. God sends the church to work for justice in the world, exercising its power for the common good. dealing honestly in personal and public spheres, seeking dignity and freedom for all people. You can go on to the PCUSA website and find their further response. I would ask you to reach out to other resources within our own presbytery. This is a Zoom conversation between, here you see Barbara Wilson and Jay Moses and Sue Crummell and Michael Kirby, each discussing how churches are handling the backlash to their support of Black Lives Matter and what actions churches might need to take. I can link you to this YouTube discussion. It's about an hour long. Simply email me. I put my email in the chat function so that you can hear these voices. What else is Presbyterian leadership telling us? It's telling us to listen to the voices that understand the issue, the Black voices within our denomination. This is Reverend Denise Anderson, who was co-moderator of the 222nd General Assembly. She is now the coordinator of the Presbyterian Mission Agency's Office of Racial and Intercultural Justice. I'm going to show you two quotes from her. We want to make it very clear that much of this work on Black Lives Matter is coming from Black Presbyterian leadership. We who are here, who are leaders in the Presbyterian Church, we know what we're talking about. We're the ones who are impacted, as we are also part of you. So if you care about us, you'll care about this. It's important for majority white institutions such as the PCUSA to vocally support movements such as Black Lives Matter, because for so long, majority white religious institutions were slow to arrive to the party. So what do we do with the guidance and support offered to our churches by our own presbytery? Do we look at it? Do we consider it? Do we use it? Do we reject it? Or do we just ignore it? It's out there for us. Last week, Sweden's Olof Palme Human Rights Prize for 2020 was awarded to the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation. Black Lives Matter was honored, quote, for peaceful civil disobedience against police brutality and racial violence across the globe. The presenters also noted that about 20 million people had taken part in the Black Lives Movement globally, and along with millions around the world, not just in the US. Quote, this illustrates that racism and racist violence is not just a problem in American society, but a global problem. The foundation has, in a unique way, exposed the hardship, pain, wrath of the African American minority at not being valued equal to people of different color. This movement has become an important worldwide movement to fight racial justice. So I've talked long enough, and I'm going to put you in breakout rooms in a minute. But before we do that, I am going to show you my absolute all-time favorite Black Lives Matter sign. This is Ryan D. Wheels, or at least that's his Facebook nickname, from Bethel, Ohio. He and 80 of his friends decided to organize a Black Lives Matter rally in their hometown. And when word got out that they were organizing a rally, 800 counter protesters showed up in their small town. Ryan met them with this sign: Black Lives Matter. I'm sorry I'm late. I had a lot to learn. So I want to lastly remind you, be strong and courageous as you explore your own response to Black Lives Matter. Do you want to do the work? Do you have the stamina and the wherewithal to take this on, to begin to deal with the bottom of the iceberg and not just the tip? Next week, we're going to ask, okay, so now what? That's your homework. Think about that a little this week before we come back together. We're going to close in prayer, and then I'm going to put you into breakout rooms so that you can discuss this from your own perspective. Let's begin with prayer. I will give you the question, and then we'll go into breakout rooms. Let's pray. We thank you for the presence of authentic reconciliation that is found in the Gospels. We confess the ways that we have avoided the pursuit of justice because of the idea of reconciliation felt easier. We pray for the Spirit-led imagination to pursue justice in every uncomfortable area that is required to see true change. And we invite the Spirit to show us places where we need to participate in the ministry of reconciliation. Amen.